Right, today we're going to be talking about the 10 most popular diets. We're going to be talking about them in the context of bodybuilding, how good they are for bulking, cutting, sustainability, health, and everything else that can go along possibly with a diet. First diet is the ketogenic diet. So allow me to read you the overview of what that diet is. The ketogenic diet is a very low carbohydrate, high fat eating plan designed to shift the body from using carbohydrates for energy to burning fat instead. So that's what you get as an overview of the diet. It's just a no carb diet. So all of your macros are going to be coming from fats or proteins, basically. The pros of this: it's very good for rapid weight loss. I'm not going to say it's very good for rapid fat loss. It seems like a lot of people that go keto, they lose a lot of scale weight, but they don't necessarily lose a lot of fat and get very lean. It's just as we lose those carbohydrates from the diet, those carbs hold on to those waters. We end up dropping carbs and water weight from our body, so we see the scale go down. That's one of the main pros. Other pros is insulin sensitivity. Obviously, that goes way up because we're not eating carbs. We can sort of reset our insulin sensitivity. As far as I can see, that's really where the pros end, because as far as cons, no carbs means we've got no energy and power to train. No carbs means we're not going to feel full. There's all sorts of benefits to carbohydrates. So in sort of any diet where we eliminate one macronutrient, like in the case of a ketogenic diet, the downsides are just quite high. So if I were to say, rank that in a tier list, S through to F, I'd say ketogenic is probably right there in the D tier, but it does have, for some people, some use cases. And certainly there is days where you can have no carbohydrates and do PSMF, protein sparing modified fast, and get benefits from that. There's some days where you can just do a water fast and get benefits from that. But I wouldn't say that a ketogenic diet in the case of bodybuilding is very beneficial for many people's goals. It'll just wipe out your training, and it's not going to be positive in the long run. So no, D tier for me. Move on. The most popular diet on the internet, the carnivore diet, which is the carnivore diet meal plan. Only allows consumption of meat, poultry, eggs, seafood, fish, some dairy products, and water. So there's a bit of confusion going on between the carnivore diet, which we're going to talk about now, and the paleo diet, which I'll talk about right afterwards, because they're pretty similar. But the carnivore is pretty much just meat, eggs, and fish. And the paleo diet is more of like, what did the cavemen eat? And that will be like meat, eggs, fish, berries, and sort of like stuff you could pick off a tree, like nuts and stuff like that you wouldn't have to harvest and farm. So it's like pre-agricultural diets is what the paleo diet is, and then the carnivore diet is just eating like an animal. It's very high in protein. It's very high in fats. So the carnivore diet does oftentimes become a ketogenic diet. So that's why I've put them in this order of keto and then carnivore, because I think carnivore is far more restrictive than keto. The carnivore diet falls into the same problem that the keto diet has, and it has the same pros as a keto diet. It's got the cons now. Obviously, you've got no carbohydrates, so you're training heavy lifting, heavy volume, high lifting, all of those things that carbohydrates helps. We don't get those benefits. We don't get any of the benefits from carbs, because the carnivore diet, I'm going to put it down in that D tier as well. I'm going to say it's just as bad, maybe even worse than a keto diet. But especially with the internet sort of carnivore diet, where we're eating lots of organ meats, we can sort of run into trouble with having way too much vitamin A and sort of running into problems like that. But everyone will always deny it. It's quite a dogmatic diet. So it's one of those on the internet where people who love it or hate it, like Marmite, but I think they're only really in it because it's a thing, and it's more of a tribal us versus them than actually whether it's a good diet or not, but I don't think it is. We'll move on to a slightly more sensible version of the carnivore diet now, which is the paleo diet. So the paleo diet is a dietary approach centered around eating foods presumed to be available to hunter-gatherer ancestors during the Paleolithic era, primarily focusing on lean meats, fish, eggs, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds. So yes, we are now eating some carbohydrates in the forms of fruits and vegetables. We're eating some nuts and seeds. This diet is far better than the carnivore diet. If you've got your fruits pre-workout, post-workout, you've got vegetables all throughout the day, you can actually get some benefits from training. It's just not going to be as high on the carbs. You can become an absolute fruit bat on a paleo diet and all your carbs can come from fruit, but this is all going to be from fructose, not glucose, which will go to our liver first, which is a shame because we kind of want it to go to our muscles for that glycogen to lift the weights, but it's just not as bad. And the vegetables, obviously the carbs from the vegetables can go to those muscles, but the amount of fiber we'll be eating to get the sort of same carbs from simpler carbs, it's not going to add up very well. But I do feel like the paleo diet is quite a healthy diet in terms of, obviously I said we were talking about health and sustainability. Keto, not very healthy, not very sustainable. Carnivore, also not very healthy, not very sustainable. You're not eating veg or fruit in either. Paleo diet, I'd say, is quite healthy, it's quite sustainable, and some people do quite enjoy it because it gives you sort of a list of cans and can'ts, do's and don'ts, and it's quite black and white, so it makes shopping easier, it makes budgeting easier. It's one of those diets that I think sort of slept on, so I'd put the paleo diet up in the B tier. I'd say it's a lot better than the carnivore or the keto. So moving on, the vegan diet. So let me go ahead and read the vegan diet for you. A vegan diet excludes all animal products, including meat, fish, poultry, dairy, eggs, and honey, focusing instead on plant-based foods like fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and grain. In terms of a diet for health, if you've got problems with your cholesterol, which plenty of people do, plenty of people don't even know that they do because they never get blood work done, but most people are going to have problems with their cholesterol. The vegan diet has no animal products, so it's not going to have any dietary cholesterol because you're not eating meat, you're not eating eggs, you're not eating anything that has cholesterol. So as far as doctors are concerned, if you want to lower your cholesterol and you don't want to take a bunch of pills to do it, it's one of those ways to do it. Then in terms of, like, in the case of bodybuilding, unfortunately, the animal proteins that we do eat, even though they've got cholesterol in them, even the leanest of cuts will have a little bit, but that's not too big of an issue. Really, if we eat nice, lean and healthy cuts and we're moving around, dietary cholesterol isn't going to be the biggest killer. It's going to be an unhealthy lifestyle. Smoking, alcohol, fat, sedentary stuff like that is going to be the problem. Cholesterol is often just there when problems occur in sort of the cardiovascular instances, cardiorespiratory instances, issues with blood. We'll notice high cholesterol, LDL being high, HDL being low, all of those things, they're oftentimes just there at the scene of the crime and they didn't cause it. You've got more problems, like far more problems than just your cholesterol to worry about. So the fact that the vegan diet's good for that alone doesn't, I think, mean it's like some golden magic S-tier diet, but it's certainly a healthy option. The fact that the proteins are not complete, unlike animal proteins, and the fact that the diet's incredibly high in fiber is a bit of a downside. And then also it seems like a lot of the foods are quite bloaty, are quite, they've got these insoluble fibers, soluble fibers, these starchy, slow release complex carbohydrates, these grains, these beans and legumes. It's quite bloating, it's quite gassy. So I'm not a big fan of the vegan diet. There is now obviously alternatives that aren't natural. They're processed vegan alternatives to protein, like textured vegetable protein, mycoprotein in your corns and stuff like that, that are actually quite high in protein. And they obviously you can supplement to have the complete proteins with like vegan protein powders and EAAs. So there's workarounds and pills you can take to actually make the vegan diet a bit better than it is just as a standalone. So I'd probably put it in the C tier. But I'm just not a huge fan of it because of the way it makes my stomach feel. And then if we move up to a vegetarian diet. So a vegetarian diet excludes meat, fish, and poultry, focusing instead on plant-based foods such as fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. But unlike a vegan, a vegetarian can eat things from animals. He can eat his eggs, he can eat his dairy, so he can have his yogurts, he can have his eggs, he can have stuff like that. All of the stuff that vegans can eat, plus eggs and dairy, is the way I see vegetarian in most cases being played around with. And that does help. That does add a couple more complete protein sources to the mix of that vegan diet. And I think it would just bump it up from a C tier to a B tier. You can definitely get good gains on a vegetarian diet if you know what you're doing with your supplements. if you know how to best perform optimally around those carbohydrates, because no longer in that vegan diet or that vegetarian diet are we restricted on what kind of carbs we can eat. We can eat our rices, potatoes, pastas, breads, all of those sorts of things around our training and get the carbs that we need. So I'd say vegetarian, great option if you're not a big fan of meat. If you're a bit scared of the cholesterol, but you're not all the way scared of the cholesterol, it's like a vegan diet plus it's nothing but benefits over that vegan diet, so it's all good for me for a vegetarian. We'll move on and we'll look at intermittent fasting, which is not a selection of foods, it's more of a rule of when we eat the foods. So an intermittent fasting diet is an eating pattern that cycles between periods of eating and voluntary fasting rather than focusing on what to eat. Popular methods include the 16-8 method, 16-hour fast with an 8-hour eating window, alternate day fasting, and the 5-2 diet. The 5-2 diet being 5 days of eating a week, 2 days of fasting a week, which I've done in the past. Quite nice intermittent fasting for some people, especially if they've got busy days and busy lives. You can choose what foods you eat, so we're going to go ahead and assume that you're making the right food choices. And then how do we use this? How do we best use this to get our bodybuilding done? Well, if we're working all hours of the day and, it just naturally occurs that we'll be fasting and then we get our big meals in, there's now this big window where we're not synthesizing protein, which is kind of not a good thing. So in the long run, I think it's just going to do nothing but limit our gains if we're trying to grow. But on a cut, limiting the amount of time we can eat is going to mean there's going to be this sort of window where we're nice and full around our training, and then we can be fasting for the rest of the day when we're not lifting our weights, and we can sort of take that sacrifice to make that cut a little bit easier. So in a cut and context, I think intermittent fasting can be quite good. The sort of the 5-2 style of intermittent fasting, where you eat 5 days a week and have 2 days of full fasting, that can be great for your insulin sensitivity. It could also be quite helpful for your cutting. But as I say, on those 2 days, it's going to be a bit of a slog to get through, and unless they're PSMF days, protein sparing modified fast days, you're not going to be synthesizing any protein, so you're not going to be making those gains, which is a bit of a shame, but I feel like it has its time and its place. It certainly is what you make it in terms of the food choices you use and how best you choose to make your windows work around your training, your fasting windows and your training windows. But I'd say it's definitely a C tier. It's a good idea for a cut, maybe not the best idea for growing. We'll move on to the OMAD diet, which I don't know how popular it is anymore. The OMAD diet, 1 meal a day, is what it stands for. So the OMAD diet is an extreme form of intermittent fasting where you consume all your daily calories within a short 1 hour eating window followed by a 23-hour fasting period. So basically you eat once a day, every day of the week, just 1 meal on each day. This is not appropriate for bodybuilding, really. Unlike intermittent fasting, I can't think of any context where you can consume all your calories, fats, and carbohydrates for the day properly in one meal and not have downsides to the fact you've just eaten an enormous meal. In most people's cases, regardless of whether they're cutting or bulking or whatever it would be, that meal is going to be huge. But now there are also going to be significant hours throughout the day where they have no protein being synthesized and they're waiting for tomorrow to come around to start that off again. So I think in the case of just protein synthesis alone, it's just completely contraindicated to bodybuilding. So I'd put that down in the F tier, and I wouldn't even look at the benefits of it because it's all downsides from there. We'll look at a very popular diet called the Mediterranean diet now, which I don't think gets used as a bodybuilding diet. It just gets used as a health diet, but it can be what you make it. So the Mediterranean diet emphasizes plant-based foods like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and legumes with olive oil as the primary fat source. It includes moderate amounts of fish, poultry, and low-fat dairy, with red meat consumed sparingly. The diet promotes a lifestyle rather than strict rules, focusing on flavor, variety, whole foods, and a healthy approach to eating that can help prevent chronic diseases like heart diseases and diabetes. So the Mediterranean diet is very healthy, it's very sustainable, it's got lots of variety, it's very tasty, it's got lots of good fats, and it's probably, of all the diets, one that mine is closest to because of just how many different vegetables and fruits I eat in a day. I only really eat lean white meats and fish, so if you were to look at anything, my diet is pretty much a Mediterranean diet minus the olive oil. I'm just not a big fan of it. I'm quite low fats on my diet, so olive oil just doesn't make sense. I think if you eat enough meat to get your protein in, the Mediterranean diet is probably one of the healthiest and best ways to go. I mean, it's not very dogmatic in the sense of like, it's telling you to eat high carbs, high fats, or high proteins or anything in any sort of ratios. It's more just telling you to eat lots of fruit and veg, save on the red meat, and then eat your protein from a lean source. It's kind of just a set of diet rules that they're just all good things. So I'd say the Mediterranean diet, at least the rules it sets, depending on how crazy you go with them, I'd say it's probably S tier. There's nothing wrong with it. I don't see anything wrong with it. It's a great base to start with. I'd give it an S tier all the way. Now we'll look at another sort of diet set of rules as opposed to an actual restrictive thing, which is the IIFYM, or If It Fits Your Macros. So the If It Fits Your Macros diet is a flexible eating style focused on meeting daily targets for macronutrients, proteins, carbs, and fats, rather than adhering to strict food rules. So you can basically eat whatever you like, as long as at the end of the day when you track your calories, you've hit the macros for the day. So say you want to hit 300 grams of protein, 600 grams of carbs, and 50 grams of fats. Once you've tracked all of the foods, if that's what you've hit, it doesn't really matter how you've hit it. Like what sort of meat you ate, carbs you ate, fats you ate, as long as you got there, that's fine. And I feel like this is one of those ones where it becomes, as much as it's flexible, it becomes sort of an issue of like, now we're just eating like weird foods to bridge these gaps where we need X amount of something to fill up the rest of the day. So we're eating something really obscure, egg whites to make it up, or like, oh, I've got no carbs left for this meal and now I can't train or I can't train with any carbs, because it's like one of those where you have to kind of get good at it, and it's only as good as you are at doing it. It can definitely be an absolute S tier if you're nailing all your foods all the time, and then you've got a bit of flexibility, and it's like, oh yeah, I'll switch out rice today for potatoes tomorrow because it'll be the same amount of carbs because I'll have a bigger bowl of potatoes to make up the difference. Or it's like, oh, I fancy some red meat today instead of white meat, so I'll have a bit less fat on this. And you kind of like pull things around, and as you get used to it, you sort of realize what you can switch out for what. But just for like beginners, I feel like it's quite daunting to like actually meet those numbers because you don't know the macronutrient values or the targets, and you don't know what's in the foods. But the more you do it, the better it gets, because it becomes like super easy to be there like, oh yeah, I'll just swap out this one banana for 2 small oranges and it's the same amount of carbs, give or take. And you kind of like, but I feel like that's where it falls off, is because the more you do it, the better you get at it. But then there's also like near enough, close enough, and you sort of stop measuring things, stop managing things. And I see a lot of people who do a If It Fits Your Macros diet, they're no longer even tracking their macros, they're just kind of like vibing, and they're just doing what I would call like a mindful eating diet, where they sort of know intuitively what they need to eat before they train, after they train, what's good for breakfast, that sort of thing. And they're eating like healthy options for all of those. And that's great. I'd say mindful eating like that is also great. So I'd say If It Fits Your Macros and mindful eating are definitely S tier if you know what you're doing. And then the less and less experience you have, the worse and worse they'll get, to the point where they could even be F tier if you're like really bad at tracking, you're not tracking properly, or you're not tracking at all and you're mindful eating, but you don't know what you're on about. Those is when it would become harmful. So I'd say it's one of those things where you actually need to pay attention to it in the start, and you need to make sure that you're properly tracking the things in the start. You're not just saying like, oh, I had X slice of pizza, put it on my app, but you had like 3 slices, not 1, but you track 1 because, oh, it was only a small slice, and you put it from one product, but it was actually another product with completely different macros to what's on the back of the box you ate to what comes up on your app, kind of thing. I see that all the time where people use different apps, and you can plug in one day's worth of food on one app, the same day's food on another, get completely different results. You just need to be mindful of it with actual like proper tracking, and that's the only downside, is it's only as good as you are at it. But I feel like it's a great way to have a very flexible, because obviously it's a long road bodybuilding, so having a bit of flexibility is nice, and I think that does work quite well. And the last diet we're going to talk about is the classic bodybuilding diet. So the classic bodybuilding diet, popularized by Arnold Schwarzenegger and based on the 40-40-20 diet principle, 40% of your calories from carbs, 40% from proteins, 20% from fats. Focuses on a high intake of lean protein sources like chicken, eggs, and fish, accompanied by complex carbohydrates such as brown rice and sweet potatoes for energy, and healthy fats from sources like nuts and oils. The diet emphasizes whole foods, including various meats, dairy, grains, fruits, and vegetables, consumed consistently to fuel muscle growth and recovery. So, I mean, what can you do but say that that's almost just a bit like a Mediterranean diet, but we're saying you need to eat a bit more meat and a bit more rice and a bit more broccoli, basically chicken, broccoli, and rice somewhere in your diet, and you've got the classic bodybuilding diet. And I feel like that's S tier as well, because as much as it might be very restrictive to say, oh, those are the only foods you can eat, it's also quite freeing in having sort of a small list of foods that you can eat. Obviously, I'm not saying the only three you can eat is chicken, broccoli, and rice, but you get my meaning if I say that, and like if it fits your macros or mindful eating, you do sort of just stick to those whole foods, those vegetables, those fruits, those lean cuts of meat. If those are the only foods you eat and you're quite restrictive in that sense, it does sort of free you up to have easy things that you can have meal prepped, cooked, and then you don't need to worry about food, and you don't need to worry about tracking or chasing down those macronutrient goals, because everything in your fridge is already cooked up. That goal is already hit. It's just waiting for you to eat it, basically. And that can make life quite easy. So I think that in that sense, it's very good. But for some people, it's very restrictive. So they'd much rather do a bit more mindful eating and a bit more of that if it fits your macro sort of thing. But it is what you make it in that sense again. But I think it's S tier. And then if we were to talk about any other kind of diet, I'd be talking about sort of like the carb cycling side of things. But I feel like that would require its own video to talk about proper carb cycling. And then also maybe its own style of video to talk about the proper low fat or no fat, super high carbohydrate days of the Milo Sarchev super high volume training. I feel like that would require its own video, because that's almost like, as much as these are like simple diets to follow, like, oh, I'm a carnivore, I'm just going to eat meat and eggs and stuff. Oh, I'm this, I'm just going to do this and this. Some of those diets also come with, I need to train in a certain way to make this diet work. I need to do certain things to make this diet work. I need to do fasted cardio to make this diet work. And it's more of like an entire training regime that the diet comes with. The diet can't really be taken away from it because it won't work on its own. And the regime and the stuff you do can't really be taken away from the diet, because then it becomes ineffective. And I feel like they all have at least one use case scenario, but some of them are obviously ones you'd want to run for a much longer amount of time. Some of them you might use as like a plaster fix for health issues, for insulin sensitivity, for sort of like blood markers, those sorts of things. But the ones I would recommend that you could stick to for a long time would be a Mediterranean diet, a bodybuilding diet, some form of if it fits your macros, some form of mindful eating, and you could possibly throw in some protein sparing modified fasting for your insulin sensitivity, days where you only will eat protein, and maybe some water fasting for your insulin sensitivity in those intermittent fasting sort of states where you'll only drink water for a day. And that can really help reset your insulin sensitivity, reset the stomach, allow you to feel a lot fuller on your diet. It can also help you feel a lot hungrier on your diet as well. It depends how you do it, how you use it. But those are the sort of ones I'd recommend. And then I'd stay away from sort of the dogmatic ones. I feel like they're quite restrictive. And then maybe the in the middle intermediate ones, and stay away from the OMAD as well. And then the intermediate ones, I'd say like a vegetarian diet would be quite nice. Possibly a paleo diet, even though I said that's quite dogmatic, that could also be quite nice. And those sorts of things, those could work quite nice. But that's my take. That's my video. I hope that all makes sense. I'll see you guys.